We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this word that has come up earlier, the word charrette. Have any of you participated in a charrette process before? No, okay. So the charrette process is a process that architects learn in architectural school. I went to school, I had to take pre-architecture classes and then 3 years of design and graduate school and so forth. And during that time, I took a semester of charrette design, which they called esquisse, which is the French word for sketch, but it's an accelerated way to design. And so architects learn how to do this, and then they do whatever they can to avoid it the rest of their careers, because it is a terrifying way to design. But it is an extremely valuable way to design because it engages with the client at a much higher level than architects are used to doing. What architects typically do, if you've ever worked with an architect, is they'll come in and they'll go through a programming exercise to get the program down, and then they disappear into their studios for weeks, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And 3 or 4 or 5 weeks later, they'll come back and they will bring the drawings to the client group and they'll show them the drawings. You know, in my early stages of my career, that was all done on foam core boards that we would put together that would illustrate the schematic design for the project. These are not working drawings. These are not permit drawings. These are the schematics. So elevation views, maybe you had some time to do some rough sketch perspectives, floor plans, maybe a simplified site plan, okay? So you come in with this stuff, and you put them up there, and you explain the project to the solution to the client group, and the client group will oftentimes say, well, gosh, that seems to work pretty well. We like that. We like this, but gosh, that building just doesn't look like the building that we had imagined. We're not sure that that's us. Or, I mean, they'll get as downright direct with you to say, gosh, that's an ugly building. You know, and as the architect who's been through the creative process at that point, you can't help but have the hair on the back of your neck stand up because somebody is criticizing your little baby. Right? You're invested at that point because that's part of the creative process. You know, if somebody did a really nice piece of artwork or a painting and put it up on the wall and somebody came up and said, man, that's a really ugly painting, you can imagine what the artist would feel. Well, architects are trained to think of, and it is, architecture is one of the fine arts. But what happens in those situations is that the architect's defense mechanism kicks in, and at that point, my job is to try to convince the rest of the group why that person is wrong. That person doesn't know anything about design. Let me tell you why this is the best design for you. And so you start to get defensive and you start to go down the road. Now, that doesn't say that you don't defend your ideas and your thoughts, because sometimes there's this point-counterpoint that needs to happen to be able to get to a good solution. But a lot of times clients are just trying to tell you, that doesn't belong in our community. It doesn't work here. Or maybe there's a functional problem. No, we can't have these classrooms over here. They need to be on this side because of the relationship issues that we had first explained that maybe you forgot. The charrette process disarms all of that. Okay, so it happens over a much tighter time frame. Financially, it's far less money, upfront commitment to do it this way than to turn an architect loose who disappears for 3, 4, 5 weeks, comes back, maybe needs to go through amendments, disappears for another couple, 3 weeks, comes back, and it prolongs the period of time. And architects oftentimes find themselves designing in a vacuum. They're out there making decisions, and they're not getting the kind of feedback from people that know the ministry or know the relationships or know what's important to them. They're down in the weeds designing something that maybe they haven't quite understood from the client group. Whereas the charrette process brings people together to be able to do this. And it's very cost efficient, and it's a really good way to design. And we don't pretend to think that we're going to get it all right the first day. It just isn't going to happen. We're going to go in there, and somebody's going to say, yes, yes, no. That doesn't work for us. We need to think about that differently. So this is a good process. I had done, my background for 20 years, I'd done some churches, but my background was in the performing arts world. That's what I did, is I did large-scale performing arts centers, which was a nice extension into the church design and collegiate design and schools that need those kinds of spaces. It was a good entry into that. I'd done a fair number of schools, I'd done a fair number of churches, but again, totally screwed them up. Load-bearing masonry walls. I was designing the way that my forefathers, the people I interned under, were taught in the 50s and the 60s. And all that information gets passed on to me that you designed the building with a sense of permanency. Churches were designed like enclaves, right? Nowadays, we have to design the schools that way because of the security issue, but churches in particular were very closed off to the community, not like the community centers that we had in the first discussion. So I'm trying to relearn all this stuff 20 plus years into my career about how to make buildings flexible and open so that as ministry changes, you can change the space, you can change the nature of the space. How many buildings have I come upon where somebody says, well, we want to alter this building, we want to take out this wall and take out this wall, all of a sudden I realize, my gosh, we're talking about major structural impositions on this building. What are we going to do to solve this? In some cases, it doesn't make sense. In some cases, it makes more sense to tear the building down and start over again because the cost of retrofitting is too much. Well, this process of getting our arms around the table begins with a little bit of a homework stage, and I'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, we break our process down into 5 phases, and we break our contracts down into 2 separate contracts. Our first contract is a phase 1 contract, and it's a very limited scope, but it gets you to a viable phase 2, which our phase 2 is a combined work task of taking that phase 1 to the city or the county to get zoning approval. At the same time, you're trying to solve the financial issues, and those can be momentous. So going into phase 1, we have some things that we need to go through to make sure that we're positioning ourselves well. Design, by the way, is a lot of fun. It's a momentum building time. I enjoy it. I'm 66 years old. I still enjoy going out and doing charrettes. I'm doing 2 of them in LA next week. And I'm really looking forward to working with these groups. These are groups that are really active in their communities. One of the fellows bought a 12,000 square foot building that he wants to turn into a youth ministry center in a bad neighborhood. What a great idea. What a cool concept. I still enjoy doing that. Financial part of a project can be overbearing, difficult, but it has to be faced. And so it's a chicken and egg thing. What do? Do you start off with somebody like Tom? Maybe a conversation with you, Tom, to sort of get their understanding under their feet about how financial stuff works, like you gave information out, or you talk to Chris about what your potential is for fundraising. But it's hard to go and enact those steps until you have that schematic design. Once you have that schematic design and the architect has a feel for the range you ought to be in, then you can design something, even if it's a phased development. So our phase 1, momentum building time. Phase 2, going to zoning. Zoning is no small issue these days. Zoning officials, I used to go in and get zoning taken care of in an afternoon. I go in California now to get my zoning approved, and they'll tell you we're 12 to 14 months out to get your zoning taken care of, which in some cases, that's what it takes to get the financial part done, which is fine. But at the end of the day, a very complicated stage. Our phase 3 is a separate contract. It is getting the permit drawings done. It's when I get structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, acoustical, all those folks together and put a consolidated set of drawings that can be used to go out and get a permit, and then to phase 4, procure the project, get it into the hands of the subcontractors and find out what the pricing is going to be. All the way through these phases, we are working with a general contractor. So we have somebody like Tyler who is attending our charrette sessions. That's an important component, and it's a big switch from my past career. My past career was shielding myself from the contractor for as long as possible. Because why? The contractor was the adversary. They were the ones trying to come in and take from the project. I was there as the sole trusted advisor to the owner. And what I'm telling you this morning is, don't think of the architect as the sole trusted advisor. Think of the contractor and the subs as also as trusted advisors to a project. But you got to set the playing field right. You got to be careful about this, which I'll get into more in the second session. But that phase 4 is a time when we can use those drawings to go to market, and I'll explain how that works as I move along in this session. And finally, phase 5 is construction. But let's get back to the charrette. Okay, so the charrette happens over 3 days. There is a homework stage that goes on ahead of those 3 days. If there's existing buildings that are in play, I need to somehow assimilate the plan or figure out what's in that building. I'll put together, if there's not a CAD plan or a PDF file of that plan, I need to create one. We will model the buildings, we'll get everything ready to go so we know what it is that we're dealing with. What are the boundaries and the limits of that plan? What are the boundaries and limits of that site? What's buildable? What are the setbacks? Where's the access points? What the utility access looks like? What's the topography? What's the orientation? What's the climactic zone? Those site questions have to be answered going in so that we don't set something up to be a failure from a siting standpoint. That's a crucial part of doing our homework. It is important for us to understand the financial picture. So we have the site spacing and the needs analysis to program the building. We also want an independent financial analysis. So Tom's been helping us understand what the potential capacity is. I don't want to go into a design exercise and over-design something that they have no possibility of getting built. How frequently does that happen? Almost every project we do. 40% of the projects that I work on have already been designed by another architect. And I inherit the project, and I go into it, and I'm already the bad guy. And I wasn't even the one that designed it, but it falls apart, and primarily it falls apart because somebody did not answer the questions on budget and financial up front before they started designing. They assume, the architect assumes, like I did for 20 years, that you figured that out, that you should know what you can afford. And that is almost never the case. It is very important for the architect to be able to ask hard questions. Our typical one is we'll go into a situation and they can afford 12,000 square feet and their programming statement says they need 40,000 square feet. We're not gonna be doing 40,000 square feet unless today you can tell me that you've got some sugar daddy sitting in the background that's gonna drop $12 million on this project. It isn't gonna happen, okay? So how do we deal with it? Well, there's all kinds of ways to deal with it. First of all, let's take a hard look at your program. How many spaces in this building are 45-minute-a-week spaces? How many spaces can we duplicate or can we double up the usage of that space by thinking hard about the kinds of floor coverings or the kinds of lighting or the usage times for that space? You know, how many different spaces can we use to reduce the footprint of the building, the amount of square footage? I'm going to say this now and then I'm going to say it again later. Don't sign contracts with architects and engineers that are percentage-based contracts. If you do that, you are incentivizing the architect to avoid right-sizing the building. They want to expand everything. Why? Because they are compensated for a bigger building. You go figure out the budget, I'll figure out the program, and then you'll compensate me for this bigger building. That may never get built, but they'll get their drawing fee out of it. One of the best projects for an architect. No risk whatsoever because it's never going to get built, but they get their full fee. What a terrible process that is to set up that way. Sign fixed fee contracts, okay? Fixed fee contract says, for this scope, I'll do this. So when somebody comes in and says, hey, if we do this mechanical system in this way, we can save $15 a square foot on this building. You don't have engineers and architects fighting back with you to keep the more expensive system in. So it's important to get the contract set up properly with the architects and engineers on a fixed fee basis, which I'll get into a little bit more as we go on. Community needs analysis, that project that we did over in Harrison that John Calabrese, the associate pastor, was talking about earlier on, where they have a pre-K. About a fourth of our projects are really good fits for pre-K. About 75% of our projects, they shouldn't be doing a pre-K, but we had to understand, did this community need a pre-K? And it turned out they did. So there is a business analysis that goes on. If you're going to do a project down in Bradenton, Florida that wanted to do adult daycare, do you need it? Does your community have that need? Well, they did in Bradenton. If you're going to do an event center, if you're going to do an athletic center, like the one that we're doing in Valparaiso, does the community need it? And people will oftentimes say to me, okay, so tell us, what does our community need? I don't know, I don't live here. But I can tell you where to go to find out, or I can tell you what kind of analysis to do to find out, so that you don't make the mistake of, we will build it and they will come. That's not always true. There's a lot of groups that go out and build something and they don't come, and you're stuck holding the bag. Don't make that mistake. I mean, I understand, faith is important, but you gotta use some good common sense to understand and count the cost. Not just the cost of the materials and the labor, but what does your community need as part of counting the cost? That's an important predecessor to doing a successful charrette. By the way, Have you heard that word before, charrette? You know what the word charrette means? The word charrette is the French word for little chariot, okay? So back in the 1700s, the first organized school where they trained architects in a studio environment as opposed to going to work for an architect and learning how that one architect did it, one-on-one, you would go to the Beaux-Arts School of Design in Paris, France. There was a studio that had doors on this side, doors on that side, and at the end of the day, the cart, the chariot cart, would roll through the studio, and if your drawings weren't on the cart, you received a failing grade. So for architects, it means make decisions and get to the design solution, okay? So this is an accelerated process, and it comes from this word charrette, little chariot, which means get to your decision-making stage. It's important to do demographic studies, too, when you're doing these things. Demographics can be derived very easily. Matt's got some information, and you know, he mentioned earlier, free information is something you ought to be tapping into as much as you possibly can before you start your project. One of those things is a demographic study, to understand who is around you. What does it look like? I can tell you countless projects where the perceived demographics of the church were very different from what was out there. Why? Because they'd lived there for 30 years, but they hadn't noticed the changes. They came there with their young children. All those kids grew up, and then they want to open a pre-K, and there wasn't a 4-year-old within 5 miles. Doesn't make sense to open a pre-K if there's no children, okay? So getting the demographic information, not just in terms of age groups, but the ethnicities, the financial demographics of the area, all those things can be derived very accurately and very well using programs. So I would tap into that with Matt, and he'll show you how he can do that. Architects for years have been using this phrase, architects and contractors alike, and this comes from an early Roman architect by the name of Vitruvius. Vitruvius, 2,000 years ago, says that there's commodity, delight, and structure. Well, that's translated into budget, function, and aesthetics. So delight is aesthetics, commodity is budget, structure is function. He said those three components are really important to answer in any project. This is a Roman architect 2,000 years ago. And architects have latched onto this and said, these are the three things. But what happens in almost every case is builders and architects have grown up in a culture that says you get 2 out of 3. You don't get all 3. If you want the building to be a really good-looking building that functions really well, we're going to spend money like there's no tomorrow. If you want something that's really cheap and really functional, it's going to be one ugly building, I'm afraid. Well, we can't afford to do that. We have to find balance between these three. And you know, I served for a year, 2 years, as the head of the American Institute of Architects for the state of Utah. It was an elected position. So for 2 years I did this, and I was put on to the interviewing team at the state of Utah on numerous projects, and I would hear contractors, architects come in repeatedly and say, which 2 of these 3 are we going to focus on this project? Because they're not going to give you all 3. You have to be able to find balance between all 3 of these. If you don't, let's say that you want function and budget, and you're going to let aesthetics go by the wayside, your community is going to insist on it for you anyway. They're going to come in and say, we're not putting that ugly building up in our community, right? So you've got to find balance in these 3 things. It's very important for us to consider that right from the get-go. I'll come in oftentimes with a bubble diagram like this that's somewhat of a 2-scale bubble diagram, or I may come in with 2. I'm going in next week with 3 bubble diagrams, 3 different ways that space can be organized so that I can give them something to react to. I don't want to show doors and toilet stalls and access points yet. I don't want to get involved in that because I don't want them focusing on the details. Somebody involved in ministry will say, well, where's the door to the bathroom? I don't know yet. We're not going to think about that. All I want you to do is tell me, is the bathroom in the right place? Does this organizational strategy make sense? That organizing strategy right there is the same thing that I showed you earlier with the circle, the big circle in the middle and all the circles around the outside. That's what that is. You walk in, the gathering area, that's where I go to church, that's where I get a cup of coffee, there's the bathrooms, there's the kids check-in. Everything is right there. That may not be what they want. Maybe they want something with a front porch, a lobby that runs across the front of the building, and a different organizational strategy. Or maybe the land demands it. So I'll come in with this kind of stuff because I want, on the first night of a charrette, people to respond to those organizational strategies so that we can get everybody on the same page. I haven't started designing. I don't know what the building looks like yet. But by the time I leave that first night, I want people to be able to say, yes, we're in agreement. We like that one. And maybe it's a hybrid of these 2. Maybe there's aspects of this that we like. Can we shift the administration space over here? But I want to be able to leave that everybody is more or less on the same page. And if they're not, I may end up having to follow two schemes simultaneously for a while till we prove it out. The deliverables are a master plan, site plan, and oftentimes client groups will say, we want a master plan, and the architect's thinking site plan, and they're thinking the whole deal, conceptual design all the way across. So I want to get this terminology right. Architects are trained to think of master plans as site plans. That's what gets submitted to the city. Floor plans, exterior 2D elevations, 3D renderings, all of this is coming out of that charrette process. So in the second night, I may show something like this. Now, that's not something you hand to a builder to go get bids with, right? But you can identify some clear things on this diagram. What can you see here? You can see how I get onto the site. You can see what's landscape and what's parking. You can see how many parking stalls. You can see where the building's placed, what the orientation is. You can see where the landscape is in the back. This one happens to be one in Belton, Texas. And those trees back there are along a river that they wanted to orient their building, their break space on the back side of this building, their outdoor space. So, but there's a lot of things you can tell from this, but it's diagrammatic, it's schematic, but it gives something for people to get their teeth into. The second night, I'll show floor plans. We've gone from bubble diagrams now to floor plans. At that point, I start to fill it out. You can see chairs in the worship. You can see what the worship center is and how many chairs are in there. You can see classrooms, where the doors are. You can see the stage and what the stage looks like with instrumentation and a choir group on the stage. So all of those things are identifiable. And this is derived from that earlier diagram. You can see walking into the gathering area and everything is available to me. There's where I take my kids to check in. Here's where I go get a cup of coffee. Here's worship, so on and so forth, is available off of that type of space. I'll show people these elevations. They don't really understand them because they're two-dimensional. They're hard to read. Even something like this that doesn't have shadows, it's hard to tell what's in the foreground or what's in the background. But I can show them things like this, and they totally get it. So this is a rendering. This is not the kind of stuff we do during the charrette. We will do SketchUp diagrams using 3D. It's a step below this, but at least it gives people an understanding of massing and color and material, shape and form, proportion, what I would call the free tools of architecture. Proportion is free, folks. You can do proportion badly, or you can do proportion well. It doesn't cost any more to do it well. Color is the same way. You can use color badly, or you can use color wisely. So these are the kinds of things we have to emphasize. Maybe the budget demands simplicity. Simple buildings can be beautiful buildings if they're proportioned well and if they're done right. These kind of things are very helpful, though, when you have people who are engaged in the process who cannot read two-dimensional diagrams. So eventually we get to these fly-arounds, and that's all part of the charrette process. But these fly-arounds come following a couple of weeks of back and forth and tweaking the plan. Or eventually we can get to interiors. Interiors too, now we get a sense of the scale of the space. The same space can be very easily looked at and say, well, we've got black painted open structure, what I call starry, starry night. You see little glimmers of light up there, but you don't see much else. A lot of people nowadays want to say, well, what if we do that in white? What does it look like in white? Which is back to a trend that happened in the early 1990s. And does it open up the space? And we can show them what it would look like. So really important types of animation tools are available to us now. And the ways of doing it are so much better. Even 5 years ago, we would do an interior animation, and the people hadn't quite caught up to the architectural tools yet. So the people all walked around like they had monkey arms. They were like this, like gorillas walking through the space. But now the people you can see movement that makes sense, Finally, we get to a stage where we can properly estimate the project. Now, at this point, we have been designing with somebody like Tyler sitting at the table with us. And it's important to understand the value of having a contractor who's not only there to help guide the cost of the project, but who is also invited to talk about design, okay? So having somebody who is not treated as the adversary, who understands the local area, and who feels the freedom to be able to talk outside their area of training or expertise, but who is involved in design all the time. That's a cooperative relationship, okay? So we insist on having a builder at the charrette. We want the builder to participate, not just to control costs, but all the things that I just mentioned. And eventually we get around to doing a very detailed cost estimate because counting the cost is biblically mandated, right? I mean, for gosh sakes, Jesus was using parables to talk what man starts a project and doesn't count the cost. A lot of them, they don't count the cost and they get themselves upside down on cost. And then they call me and say, hey, I had a project in Phoenix one time call me up and say, we got a project, we're a big church, we got a project, we have a budget of $11.5 million, big project. Our final numbers came in on the drawings, $34 million. Can you tweak the project? No, I can't tweak the project. We can start over again, but we're not going to tweak the project and bring it from 34.5 down to 11. Let's talk about phasing. The charrette gives us an opportunity to talk about how we phase. Let's talk about what your priorities are. How do we prioritize these spaces? How do we do them in a logical format? The charrette process works really well. Okay, I'm going to shift gears to the delivery method. And I mentioned to you when I first got up this morning that we have crossbred two primary forms of contract. The two primary forms of contract used in the United States today, and there's some subsets underneath each one of these, but the two primary forms are design, bid, build. Is you hire an architect, you interview some architects, you hire that architect, the architect comes in, listens to your needs, designs a building, produces the drawings, and puts them into the open marketplace for bids. Okay, no general contractor has been selected. General contractors have not been involved. The construction estimates are done by the architects. Architects aren't very good estimators. Why? Because they don't know what the current market conditions are all the time. The builders are more on top of current market conditions. So it's important for us to have builders engaged at an earlier stage to help us make those critical decisions so we don't get all the way down the line. Northlands Church in Orlando, I inherited a set of drawings. They spent $1.2 million on their set of plans. They were $6 million over budget. We had to go in and spend another $400,000 to redo the plans, lowered the building 9 feet, completely redid the structural system, completely did the mechanical system. All the mechanical equipment was right on top of the sanctuary. From a performing arts standpoint, what a disaster. Low frequency rumble throughout their space. It was designed improperly from an engineering standpoint. They had everything in the wrong place. They had a solid flange structural beam spanning 260 feet, the long dimension of the building instead of the short dimension, instead of open web joist to put the duct up in there. We changed all the systems in the building and pulled $4.5 million and didn't change the function of the building at all. And a lot of that came from sitting at the table with a builder who was able to help us understand that, a builder who was not involved the first time. So design, bid, build, the bad part of design, bid, build is you're getting cost information that's accurate and viable too late in the process. And then you go back after the bids and you start begging for money back, and you'll get 50 cents, 25 cents on the dollar back, because they know at this point they're in a non-competitive situation. Okay, so the higher risk and more potential for litigation. Design, bid, build is a breeding ground, especially on publicly procured projects for litigation. Why? Because everybody's holding their cards close to the vest and trying to exploit the inaccuracy of a set of drawings. So out of that design, bid, build process, where the architect is the sole trusted advisor delivering information on cost very late in the game, was born design, build, or the rebirth of design, build. Design, build used to be done all the time in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Well, design, build came back into vogue in the late 80s, early 90s, largely on publicly procured projects, because publicly procured projects, city, county, federal, were spending more on litigation than they were on the projects themselves. Who was getting rich? The attorneys. The attorneys were getting rich. So they went to design, build, and they said, we're tired of you two arguing. You architects and you contractors go out and form teams and come in and bid on the project. What I would call a shotgun marriage, okay? And in a design build team, when I team up with a general contractor and I am under the same contract as them, I do not work for the owner. I work for the general contractor. They are the at-risk partner, you're not. So when you ask me, how much does that cost? You know what my answer is? That's his question to answer. I'm not talking about cost. I did a stadium project for Weber State College in the year 2000. We had 2 floors that were left unfinished. And those 2 floors, I had estimated those 2 floors, to finish those 2 floors was going to cost about $250,000 back in those days. We couldn't touch that now, but back in those days, $250,000 finished 280 long-foot floor levels off for usage. One was a gallery space for their trophies and so on and so forth, and the other space was adjunct space for their offices for the athletics department, $250,000. The general contractor prepared their own change order for the project. They came in, the owner looked at me and said, "How much do you think this is going to cost?" And I did what I was told to do. I said, "Well, that's really his question to answer." He delivered a change order for $750,000, 3 times what my estimate was. You know what I said? Not a word. It's not my job. I'm not there to govern cost. I work for the general contractor. If he could have gotten $1.5 million, that's his business, not my business. So in the design build process, you limit litigation because when problems come up, the owner says, "I'm not solving it. You 2 knuckleheads go out and figure it out." He's right. It lowers the potential for litigation, but it raises the cost of the project. And the other thing it does is it doesn't go very deep into the bid market because you don't have multiple general contractors looking at it. So they go out and they get bids. They'll tell you, "Oh, we're going to bid the project." Yeah, they do. They go out and bid it to the 3 safest subcontractors in each category. So there are pluses and minuses. We don't like litigation. We do like the saturation of a bid market, right? We do like the input of a general contractor early on. So what BGW has done is created a hybrid model out of this. These facts and figures, by the way, come out of the National Building Institute. Every year when I was doing AIA stuff, we would go back to Washington, D.C. and derive these. Back in those days, it was 70% of commercial projects are over budget. Nowadays, 78%. Almost 4 out of 5 projects are late getting delivered to the, why? Because you can't get materials. Trying to get switchgear these days, you have to order the switchgear before you sign the contract, or you're not going to get it in time for the closing of the project. So how do we solve all this? Well, these 2 forms of contract, we're going to try to take the best of what each of these 2 forms of contract have to offer and avoid the things that result in problems. And we're going to do that through the power of creating relationship. So one of the reasons that I got involved at BGW was because of the stewardship model. Stewardship is biblically mandated. And it's not just the initial cost of the building, it's the material selections that we make for a building. It's the systems that we put into the building. And sometimes those systems, it pays to put a little bit more expensive system in than the cheapest mechanical system. If you put a cheap mechanical system in and it doesn't operate at efficiency, that's bad stewardship. So you got to find the balance point there. The other side, the other reason that I came to BGW was because of ministry. We, in this room, are the light of Christ. We cannot go to war with the contractors. We have to approach it differently. We have to think differently about the way we come into relationship with people. So how can we do that? First of all, we're going to say in the very beginning that between the owner, the general contractor, and the architect, we are going to agree to put the Lord in the center of our relationship. Okay? This is important for us to covenant with one another, to say there are times where we're going to have to make a hard decision for us personally, but it's the right thing to do because it's the integrity model that the Lord insists with us. And that is not always easy. Now, I don't make any pretense. I do not deliver perfect sets of drawings. Ever. No architect ever does that. There is no such thing. The courts recognize that. The courts say, did you perform according to the standards of the industry? Did you exercise the standard level of care? Not did you exercise a perfect set of drawings. There is no such thing. But along the way, if you do something catastrophic, I had a steel manufacturer call up a draftsman in my office one time and get approval to lower the roof by changing the structural system 3 feet. The draftsman didn't bother to call me to find out if I agreed with it, and it lowered it into the Idaho state height restrictions on gymnasium space for high schools, 3 feet into that space. We ended up spending $135,000 out of our fees to raise that roof back up again because we made a mistake. Should my draftsman have said that? No. Should the guy have called my draftsman? No. But we were the ones that gave a tacit approval to do that. That's not always easy, but when you have a kind of relationship where you're trying to exercise a certain level of integrity, you have to be able to say, this was our problem, this was our issue. If we have this kind of relationship with a general contractor, we have a much better chance of taking that blue ring on the outside and squeezing that ring down rather than watch that ring grow larger. If we have general contractors and subcontractors who are following this stewardship model, we have a much better chance of reducing this down. Now that means that architects and engineers sometimes have to listen to better ways of doing things and change their drawings. So I'll explain how that happens. We call it pre-construction stewardship, and basically what we're doing is we are asking subcontractors to engage before they bid the project, okay? So this starts out with a meeting, a 1-hour meeting that we ask the ministry group to serve them a good lunch. So a room like this one, if the church doesn't have a room like this one, we'll go find a room, but typically we'll have anywhere from 45 to 70 subcontractors show up. I don't care who's hanging the doors, I don't care who's installing the toilet partitions, but I surely care about who's doing the earthwork, who's doing the site utilities, who's putting the fire sprinkler systems in, who's bidding the HVAC, who's doing the electrical, the tier 1 folks. And I want as many of them in the room as possible. I want 4 or 5 or 6 electrical bidders there. What gets them in the room? Believe it or not, lunch. Lunch goes a long way, especially if it's a good lunch. Don't scrimp on lunch. Don't put a couple of little finger sandwiches in the corner. These are folks that are working. Bring a decent lunch to bear. It's worth your time. In that 1-hour meeting, we have the ministry group stand up for 5 minutes, tell them who you are, why you're doing the project. And then you're done, 5 minutes. Then we want the general contractor to guide the meeting. Show them the drawings, show them the systems in the building, show them the scale of the project, tell them when you're starting, show them the schedule, tell them who's financing the project. They're there trying to figure out, do I get a free lunch out of the deal or are you real? If they don't think you're real, if you don't have your financing worked out, they get a nice lunch and you'll never see them again. They're not going to waste their time giving you a bid if they don't think you're financially positioned to do the project. Show them why you're financially positioned. Give them the cost estimate. They're not going to base their bid based on the cost estimate. What do they base their bid on? How busy they are and who the competition across the room is, right? So all of these things come into play. Why do we show them a cost estimate? Because they want to know, okay, they can look at a set of plans and say, okay, that's a 20,000 square foot building. Sheetrock costs are going to average about $11 a square foot. They've got $4.50 a square foot in their budget. Bzz, not real. I'm not offering a bid. Thank you for lunch. Goodbye. But if you got the appropriate amount in the cost estimate, they know you're close. They don't know what their bid number is yet because they have to figure out how busy they are and who else is in the room, who's bidding the project. But this is an excellent way for us to communicate it. And finally, at the end of that meeting, we say, we know as architects and engineers that you know more about your trade than we do. Would you be willing to take a set of plans and come back to us? And if this was your building, how would you do it? Well, you've just opened the barn door. They will come back in and have pent-up years of architects bossing them around and be able to come in and humiliate the architect. It's the humiliate the architect day. Okay, you know what it is for me? Risk mitigation day. And they bring in good ideas. They bring in stuff that is valuable to the project. By the way, you're trying to put a 26-inch duct through a 30-inch joist, through the triangular part of the joist. Doesn't fit. Well, my manual says it fits. It doesn't fit, I can tell you. They're the installers. They know this. Yeah, I can do it. I can pound the sides of the duct in and interrupt the airflow, but it doesn't fit. Let's think about it differently. If we offer them the ability to come back and offer to us where things don't work for them, or tell us what the work circumstances that look best for them, that's a really important conversation to have with a group at a time before you've asked them for their price on the project. We've had all kinds of great ideas. We had one guy say, you want to do it cheap? The church told me, the pastor told me that you guys have a lift. I don't have a lift. I have to rent one. Can I use the church lift? We look at the pastor. Sure. We'll show you how to operate it. You can use our lift. It's a hard tire lift. I got to have the concrete slabs down. We looked at the concrete guy and the general contractor. Can you guys get the slabs down before we hang the ductwork? Yes, we can do that. Now you're thinking about lean construction. You're strategizing. Again, that HVAC contractor and that concrete guy have not been selected yet. All you're doing is setting up the circumstances that's right for them to be able to offer the right bid. What looks best to you? So from my position, it's risk mitigation. I may have to go back and change a bunch of drawings. It doesn't matter. If they're giving me things to do that pull it back into budget ahead of the bid, or if they're doing things that would avoid the change order cycle that happens inside the job trailer, what a great opportunity for us to exercise that kind of wisdom into the process. We have a direct purchasing thing for certain parts of the building. We don't deal with commodities. We don't deal with concrete, sheetrock, brick, rebar. Those kind of things are all derived locally and negotiated locally. But these other things that are manufactured off-site and brought in, and if somebody in the church, let's say that you got a guy that's repping a playground company and he can get playground equipment for half the going price. Let's do that. And would he sell to us, by the way, for our projects on a national basis? So there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. This is one of them. We'll talk about life cycle costing. All kinds of great things have come out of these kinds of discussions. You could put vinyl composition tile down on a floor. It's just the ugliest material known to man, but it wears for 30 years. It is so ugly, but you have to wax it and strip it and buff it and wax it and strip it and buff it, wax it and strip it and buff it. The 25-year lifespan of a vinyl composition tile costs $1.80 to put in, costs $35 to maintain it for 25 years. Solid vinyl tiles cost double that amount going in. You'll spend $4 a square foot putting a solid vinyl tile, but there's no waxing. So the maintenance costs are half the costs of a vinyl composition tile. That's a good example of life cycle costing. If you do this, if you set it up right, if you're going to them for their wisdom and their information in a respectful relationship, you now can minister to their people. Shelley Teeters from Cross Point Church down in Cape Coral, Florida.
When BGW said that one of the hopes that they had in partnering with organizations like us is that not only are we trying to reach people in our community, but also we have a ministry opportunity to try to reach the contractors and every person who walks on the job site. That really made us excited because we too have that same mission in mind. And so we really were very intentional about the ministry through the construction process. And we found it was a real way to engage the whole church, to be a part of the process. And so we created some teams, and every single day during the construction process, we provided drinks and snacks and food. It's Florida, it's hot. And so for them to have a cold Gatorade or water and to come over and have an area, picnic tables in the shade where we can thank them and appreciate them and encourage them for what they did, that really just made it a very unique experience that I think most of these subcontractors had never experienced before. They were constantly thanking us and appreciating us for serving them. It also gave us a great avenue to, build a relationship with them. We have seen some fruit from that as well. We have a particular story where during the process, we had a contractor who was awarded a bid. He was going through a really difficult time in his life, and one Sunday, he actually showed up at Cross Point and revealed that he was just going through a really difficult time, and ultimately he rededicated his life to Christ. He's been coming to Cross Point ever since. He's in fact in my small group that meets every week, and I would never have met him, and God used Cross Point's building project to bring him back to God. And what an incredible testimony and story.